Morning, YouTubers. On today's video, we are going to be talking about arc blow. Now, arc blow is kind of a description of a symptom that can happen when you're stick welding. It primarily affects stick welding. Another term for it is also arc wandering. Now, arc wandering can happen with more than just stick. It can actually happen with TIG, and it can even happen on AC with TIG. So we're going to talk about what arc blow is, why it happens, how to avoid it, and everything to do with that. We're going to get pretty in depth with this, so grab yourself a cup of coffee, sit down, and let's talk about it. So you probably have heard me talk about arc blow in my videos before because I have experienced it here and there while I'm welding with stick. And again, arc blow can happen with TIG, but for at least this moment, we're talking about with stick welding. So you'll be just welding. I'll take this rod and we'll simulate it. We're welding, or you're welding, and all of a sudden, it's almost like the molten puddle gets a bit squirrely. You start seeing big, almost like BBs of molten metal popping up out of it. And you may actually see the electric arc start moving to different points on the plate, and just overall it's like you lost control of the rod. Now, if you experience that, the smartest thing to do is to snap out of it immediately, clean your stop up with a wire wheel, maybe a little bit of a grinder, and then use a new rod, or start with the same rod you had, start on another plate, run it for a little bit, and then cut out and then restart to where you burn off through the part that you were running. Now, the hard part with arc blow is it could be caused by any number of reasons, okay? It's not as simple as this is the exact reason it happened, okay? You might have to do some troubleshooting to figure it out. So one reason for arc blow is that if you bring your arc gap up too big, to where that electric arc is actually coming off the tip of your rod onto there, and you got quite a space, you're probably going to get more arc blow than if you just hold a tight arc. And the reason for that is that giving the electric arc more time to find a path to ground or path back to the welder is not good. And the longer your arc is, the more time that it has. And then not only that, the higher the voltage there is, and it's very likely that it's going to find an alternate path back to the welder, which then will result in uncontrolled arc, okay? Another reason is, if you look at this particular rod, you see how the tip of the rod is actually recessed back in it, okay? Quite a bit. I mean, at least an 1/8 inch, probably a little bit longer than that. Now, this is what your rod should ideally look at when you're done welding with it. What can happen during arc blow is the arc wanders out the side, and if you look at this, the rod tip of the inner metal core is closer there on this than it is on here. Now, this may be somewhat typical if you're welding with a drag angle like you should, but as you're welding, the arc may find a path back to the welder through the side of this, and it'll blow the flux right off. And in that case, again, you're going to have uncontrolled arc wandering, and you don't want that. So some rods are more prone to it than others. I find that 6013 is a very easy rod to get arc blow with, because if you look at how recessed that is, this flux, it's very easy while you're welding and you're just going along, to not realize how long your arc gap actually is, because that tip is burning off further up the rod than the flux is. And if you don't keep that nice pressure pushing that flux up into that molten puddle, it's kind of like melting a crayon off. If you're not putting that pressure on there, your arc gap will extend a little bit too long, and it doesn't take too much before it either blows out the side or ahead of your puddle, and then your flux just wanders and it just gets all over, and your arc is uncontrollable. Very easy with 6013. Some of the other rods like 6010 and 7018 I find less likely to arc blow. Now, what's actually going on is your arc wandering could be due to your arc gap simply being out of control, and it could also be caused by magnetism. Now, if you didn't fall asleep in your grade school science class, you might have remembered a little trick where they took a nail, like call this a nail, 60 penny nail, they wrapped copper wire around it, hooked it to a 9-volt battery, and then they took that nail and they picked up like metal shavings with it. Well, what they did is they created an electromagnet. Well, the same thing can happen to a hunk of steel like this. As you start welding on it, you're welding at extremely high current, okay, say 100, 120 amps, that's a lot of current, fairly low voltage, 30 volts, and this steel is going to end up heating up, and it very well, as it passes electricity, could start to form a form of an electromagnet, just like that steel nail did. Now, because you're not wrapping wire around this, the magnetism is far weaker than what you would find in like that electromagnetic nail, but that doesn't mean it does not have an effect, okay? If this steel becomes magnetized or has a slight magnetism to it as you're welding, your arc is going to wander towards or away with that magnetic poles. So you're going to get wandering of that. Now, you might keep a tight arc, like you might have this rod just jammed right in here, nice and tight, and you're just welding, and everything's going fine, and for no reason at all, you just watch the arc skip out, like out of the side of the rod, and then now you're only welding on the top plate and not the bottom, okay? If you see that, that could be induced by the magnetism that is created by all of the current that is running through this, all the electrons that are flowing through it. Now, if you have an issue with that going on, and it's not due to, say, poor rods or your arc gap, and it's due to what you believe is the magnetism that you're creating in the piece, then a couple things you can do to solve that is to relocate your ground. Now, if I were to weld this plate on this big welding table I got, odds of arc blow happening is much less than if I were to, say, stack two of these on top of one another and start welding up here, rather than having multiple places, so like this can ground out anywhere on this table over to the ground over there. If you're welding on like multiple pieces on here and you're welding up here, it only has one path to ground right here. So in such a case as that, you may, or if you're like welding a pipe on out in a field or something, or a fence post, you may have to relocate your ground cable. So you may want to clamp it directly to the piece. You may want to use two ground cables where you clamp one ground cable to the piece, and then off that ground cable, you come to another ground cable that clamps here. If you have two ground clamps on this, I assure you, you would almost have zero probability of having arc blow or arc wandering. And the reason behind that is when you're welding this, say we have the ground clamp right here, and you're welding right down this, right? We'll simulate this. As you're welding here, this red hot weld in this area, its ability to become magnetized or function as an electromagnet is going to be very limited, okay? And essentially, electricity is going to flow through it differently than ahead of your weld where it is not red hot. So what can happen is, as you're welding, you get to about right here, especially on, say, like an inside corner joint. When you get to this point, the electricity, there's a saying that it follows a path of least resistance. That's somewhat true. It follows multiple paths of low resistance in kind of like an overall spread, like roots of a tree. Well, if you get to this point, you may at this point have been using the ground path or path back to the welder up through here to your ground clamp. Say it's up here, and you may have been following it here. It may have been going down through the plate and up, who knows? And then essentially when you get to here, you've cut off multiple ways it might have been using the ground path, or the path, we'll call it the path to return the power to the welder. And now it has only one way to get to the ground clamp here, and maybe the resistance of that is higher. So rather than following that path, the arc comes off the tip through the side of the rod and shorts out a new path, and the arc then jumps from where you expected it to be over to a new point that forms a better path back to the welder. And that is why, generally speaking, when you're welding on something like this, you want to put the ground clamp closest to the end where you're going to end and not at the start, because you will cut off multiple paths that could function as a return of the electrons back to your clamp. Okay, so simply in a case of this, if you're doing a bunch of widgets like this and you keep getting to this point and just start throwing buckshot BBs out in the arc's trash, move the clamp from here to here. Now on my welding table, if I was experiencing that, what I could do, like I said, rather than grounding to this big thick table, I could actually ground directly to the piece. And you have that option too. Or I could hook another ground clamp from the one that's there and clamp it on this side of the table. And that may help as well. It's no different than, you know, if you had it leaned like this and you're welding it with a long arc and then you tip it, your arc is probably going to jump from here over to here because there's a difference in what the path back to the welder is. So that's another way that you could have arc blow. Now, another thing that can cause arc wandering is if you don't prep your material well, and you look at this, I mean, this I did for a previous test, but I didn't do a lot of prep work on this top plate or this. Now this side I did. And what can happen is as you're welding, if you hit a bunch of mill scale or oil, it can cause a gas buildup inside of the weld, and then it can just spit it out, which then could break the flux off the end or like melt it off in an unusual pattern, and then next thing you know, you get arc wandering. So again, it really pays to at least look at possible reasons as to why you're having the wandering. Okay, you can't just say, oh, well, it's just a ground issue. Well, you may not have the ability to move your ground, or you may change the ground and it's still experiencing the arc wandering. So you got to kind of troubleshoot that. Now, occasionally, you may weld on material that is magnetized. And that does happen. I've seen pictures of guys out in the pipeline fields where they literally can hang a 2 or 4 pound mallet off the end of a pipe that they're supposed to weld on. Well, you can imagine the effect that could have on an arc. I mean, if it's strong enough to hold a 4 pound sledge on the pipe, or a pickaxe I've even seen, you can imagine that arc is going to have very hard time to be stable. But it might be the point to where, like, if you try and weld on a magnet, good luck. Like a straight up magnet, good luck. You just got to do what you got to do, I guess, and the weld quality is going to suffer. Not that you really generally weld on a magnet, but you get the idea. So I did some digging over on American Welding Society pages. I found this. So what this is recommending as a possibility to solve it is to use a high amperage AC power supply, wrap the lead a bunch of times around the pipe itself, and then weld on a plate that's attached to that lead at high amperage with a big rod. And what that will do is it will basically create an electromagnet out of the pipe with the coils of wire. And if it's strong enough, it will cancel out the natural internal magnetism inside of the pipe. The other recommendation I read is to use a degaussing machine, which apparently bigger pipeline jobs have. So that's an option as well. So I just thought that was interesting and would share. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to set up a test plate, and I'm going to put a magnet on it, a little super powerful magnet, and we're going to watch at the effects that it causes to the rod. So let's talk about what we found here. Now, unfortunately, my little super strong cube magnet is no longer a magnet. So due to the heat and the current passing through the area it was in, this sucker was strong, well not anymore, but I guess it was a worthy sacrifice for the video that it gave us. Now, it still sticks to another magnet. These magnets, which are still super strong, barely get them off my table, likely due to their mass, they were able to dissipate the extreme heat nearby and they still function as a magnet, so that's good. We saw that I had a little cube here. As I crossed near it, the arc wandered away from it. So it was repelled by that part of the magnet, which is exactly what happens with your metal if you're welding and you have induced electromagnetic forces essentially in it. You can get arc wandering either away or towards. Now, once I made it past that, it kind of was welding good. Now over here, which those magnets, the round ones, had a much stronger magnetic force. Once I made it to about here, and I was welding around the magnet, I didn't just want to weld the magnet to the plate, but once I got to about here, you saw in the video, it just started spitting buckshot out. The arc was pretty much uncontrollable. So that is a prime example of a worst case scenario arc blow. Now, it had a pretty decent path to ground. I purposely set it up here to limit it somewhat, just to kind of get a higher probability of arc blow so you guys could see firsthand what it looks like. But it, without a doubt, arc blow. One of the things that you can do to try and alleviate arc blow is to weld on AC. Now, if the current that you're running through the metal is creating basically electromotive force or electromagnetic forces, by welding on AC, as the voltage climbs and then drops to negative, positive, negative, positive, negative, that will counteract and pretty much cancel out any kind of magnetism that you're creating in it. And that's why stick welding on AC, like the tombstone welders and stuff, you'll never have arc blow caused by that. Now, you might have arc wandering caused by like poor contamination, poor base metal issues, or rod issues, but the AC will solve any kind of arc wandering or arc blow due to magnetism. So what I'm going to do now, just for kind of, I'm curious to see what will happen, I'm going to put that magnet back on this plate, switch my welder to weld on AC like a tombstone welder, and then I'm just going to see. I have a feeling due to the extreme magnetism, we're still going to get some arc blow, but I don't know. We're going to experiment and see. All right, well, that sucker's hot, so yep, we smoked the magnet pretty good, I think. Yeah, that's fine. Look at that. No magnetism due to the heat and current. Ooh, that's hot. Now, I ran one bead. So these aren't the prettiest beads. I ran one bead here and then I decided to try and run one more here and then didn't realize how strong those magnets were because it sucked the rod right over and broke my arc pretty much. But I will say that I did hold a little too long of an arc gap here and I could feel it trying to pull my rod over. But the actual arc itself to me, and maybe you didn't see it in the video, but it seemed to stay more or less the same. It definitely wandered a lot less than the DC side. I mean, it still spit some buckshot BBs over here, but just from my visually running it, it seemed less affected by it. And remember, this is a magnetic source that exists that's separate from what we're inducing via welding. So if it's a welding induced magnetic force, then AC will 100% eliminate it. But I can tell you that if I had to weld on something that was magnetized, the AC, I would say, is a definite better way to go. Ooh, that's hot. My God, how many times am I gonna burn my thumb? So running on AC fixes it, changing ground fixes it, prepping your material better fixes it. Let's talk about doing some rod inspections. Now, you can see here, this rod's all chewed apart quite a ways up. Now, if we go and weld with this guy and then it burns up to this point, what do you think's gonna happen once it crosses over? You're gonna get arc blow or arc wandering because it's gonna unstabilize the arc with no flux and just the bare rod. Now you may inspect a normal rod and rather than, I mean, this is so obvious you would think a blind man would see that. This here looks fine, but maybe there's a crack in the flux a little bit and that might be all it takes. So if you ever buy a box of rods and you just are telling yourself like, man, I seem to have a lot of arc blow issues, inspect the rods very closely and look for like breaks or cracks. Like all of that can play a role. And that's also why you want to keep your rods in the box they came in and preferably with a little bag of desiccant in like an ammo tin or something else. Keep the moisture off of them. I mean, besides the fact that rods like 7018 need to be low moisture, but it's okay if most of your rods are kept in a fairly low moisture environment, simply because that will deteriorate them over years and years, and then you will have issues again with arc blow due to your rods, just like this one. So before we wrap this video up, I want to talk about arc wandering with TIG. Now, with TIG welding, we weld steel on what's known as DCEN. EN meaning that the electrode, which is a tungsten, is negative and the base material, or in this case, this, is positive. Now, on DCEN, arc wandering isn't really that common. The reason is that electrons congregate per se. They collect on the tip of this tungsten and then they jump over into your base material because electrons flow from negative to positive. Well, in the case of stick welding, most rods and under most circumstances, you weld DCEP where your electrode, meaning the metal core in here, is positive and your workpiece right down here is negative. Well, that means that as the electrons build up on the metal, they jump towards the tip of this. Well, if you can imagine, what would be better at controlling where electrons wind up, where your heat goes, is that coming from a small tip out in a cone towards your metal, or coming from a cone to a small target? And the answer is, well, when you weld where DCEN like TIG, where it comes from the small tip to the target, there's a lot less of a chance of the electron missing where you want it to go. So that's why partially with stick welding that you have arc blow as often as you do when you weld on DC is simply because those electrons have a very small target to hit, and it's not too uncommon for it to come out of maybe the side of the steel jump through the flux into the rod, and now you have an arc path that's not what you intended. So that is part of the reason why stick welding has more arc wandering than, say, with TIG. However, like I had mentioned earlier in the video, TIG can experience arc wandering too. Magnetism will affect it, and I even took a great video that turned out awesome. I'll put it up now that we can all look at. Now, wasn't that a cool video? If you liked it, give me a thumbs up on this video. So we saw clearly it pushed, that little magnet pushed that arc right out of the way. So electromagnetism and magnetism in general will affect the TIG arc. It's just that because we weld on DCEN, the effect of it isn't as significant, especially because we're not relying on flux for shielding and all of that. So it's not as significant. However, TIG on AC, because on AC current is both going from the tungsten to the work and coming from the work to the tungsten. And if you've ever TIG welded on AC, it looks like lightning is jumping out of the material up to the tungsten. Well, any magnetic force in the piece or nearby can affect how that, the path it takes from the work to the tungsten. And not only that, is that it's aiming for a very small tip, that sharpened tip of the tungsten, which is why sometimes, like on AC, when you're welding, say down on something like this, and you got your TIG torch and you're welding, and you go on an inside corner like this and you try and weld out, the arc may, like, all of a sudden it wants to go to this piece and not this, and now you can't, like, even if you tip the tungsten, it does not want to go to here. And that can happen because of the path to ground is disrupted, very much like with stick. And even on AC with TIG, you can get that. And that's why I find with AC TIG on thicker material, and especially on inside corners, is that putting a bowl on the end of your tungsten actually helps with that, because it gives a bigger, more solid target for those electrons to hit. And if you weld enough with it, you see that, like your arc cone, which just is like brightness. You don't see electrons, you just see, it's almost like a plasma per se. And you see that when you have a ball on it at above 120 amps, that plasma, or light is probably not plasma, is just more consistent and is less likely to wander than with a sharpened tip. You could get arc wandering. And like I said, for the same reason with stick, you might cut off your ground path. So ground does play a role in TIG with keeping the arc where you want it with AC. But let's wrap this video up. So yeah, I learned a lot. Hopefully you learned a lot. If you got any questions, comments, concerns, like what I do, video ideas, whatever, leave me a comment. I read them. I appreciate all of it. I'm here to help you guys, and I really enjoy doing this. So it gives me the ability to share some of my knowledge with people that are hungry for knowledge. So if you're thirsty for knowledge, I'm here to give you that. So I appreciate everything. Till next time, thanks.